What's so fascinating is I've been spending the last 4 months thinking about bringing back all the memories of Richland because of the work we're doing on this book. So, my dad was an engineer, so he did everything quite precisely and the same way every day. He had his precise routine. He'd get up at 6 and he'd come down and just pour layer upon layer of cereal into his bowl. He had this formula. He had like half a bowl of Cheerios and then a layer of grape nuts on top of that and then a layer of cornflakes, and then he'd slice his banana and put it around the top. So everything he did was very precise. And he wore the typical uniform of the white-collar workers at Hanford, which is like a white short-sleeve shirt, and he had a pocket protector of the engineer. They all wore pocket protectors, and they had a pencil type of badge that they'd wear to detect external exposures. Note that that does not include internal exposures, that's only external. And he only wore his pencil badge at work. We learned later, much later, like 1988, I learned about the radioiodine releases. And we learned that a lot of the radioiodine was released at night. So the people like my dad who were at work all day with their pencil badges on would get the external exposure readings during work hours, but then all the time at night while they were inhaling the radioiodine that was being released into the environment and off-site, none of that registered, and none of the inhaled iodine during the day. Anyway, as I grew up, my dad built a boathouse down on the Columbia River. It's one of the first boathouses built down there, in typical, very neat and strong and thorough engineering style with his engineering buddies. It's a boathouse that's still there now because it was so well built. It had aluminum roof on it, and it housed our boat, which he built in our backyard out of our F house. And we would power up and down the Columbia every weekend when the weather was good and go to the reach. And there were islands out in the reach where I would spend hours digging in the muck and sand, which I later learned was infused with cobalt-60. Just a layer of cobalt-60 in the muck on the island. So I would dig in the cobalt-60 like all kids would and pick pebbles up and save the pebbles. But we would spend lots of time on the islands and digging in that radioactive muck, and then we would swim in the river. And a lot of us as kids remembered the warm place in the river, which had to have been an effluent area because the river is very cold. So there was a warm spot which the children liked to swim in. And we believed that was one of the areas of the effluent from the reactors where the water would dump back into the river. So we were combining, sitting in the cobalt-60, inhaling the radioiodine 131, swimming in the effluent, and eating the vegetables and fruit that was covered with whatever was being emitted into the air. And this was all during our childhood years when you're most vulnerable to exposures. As I grew up, then it was very much a normal childhood in a really kind of happy environment. That's what Richland felt like. And you didn't notice anything abnormal about it as a kid. But as I grew up, I started to develop very slowly the first symptoms, very subtle symptoms, of what I now know was hypothyroidism, which is low-functioning thyroid. And because the Department of Energy had not told anyone about the radioiodine releases, no one suspected that my thyroid could be the cause of the problems I was having. It was only through the work of Tim Connor and Reverend Huff and Larry Shook in Spokane through HEAL, that's the Hanford Education Action League, that the 19,000 pages of documents on Hanford were finally released in 1986. Before that time, nobody really knew about the radioiodine. So I started to develop these symptoms, which actually were from hypothyroidism, at about 20 years after my exposures. It takes a while when it's chronic low-dose exposure for the symptoms to start developing. First, I found I was just quite tired, tireder than I should be as a young person. And then I started getting a lot of muscle cramps, terrible indigestion. I started gaining weight even though I didn't eat very much. And then the symptoms got progressively worse, but I adapted to them and never was tested correctly to find that I had a thyroid disease. And by the time I was in my late 20s, and my family had been transferred from Hanford to San Jose, California, where the General Electric offices were, and from San Jose, California to Spain, where there was GE was transferring a lot of their nuclear projects overseas because there weren't enough contracts in the U.S. anymore. So by the time I was in my late 20s, I had become amenorrheic, which means I had no more menstrual periods, and I was gaining weight, and I was becoming kind of tense in a way, and no one knew what was wrong with me. So the Spanish doctors got very upset because when a woman stops menstruating, that's like horrible. The Spanish just can't handle it. So they shipped me back to the U.S. for tests. They couldn't find anything wrong with me, and because they didn't know to test for thyroid disease at that time. And I guess it wasn't typical to test women for thyroid disease. And because the Department of Energy had still not told us at that time about Hanford, if they'd told us earlier, it would have avoided years and years of all these bizarre health problems. And it would have helped a lot of us just to be told to go in and get ourselves checked for thyroid disease. So I actually continued as more and more hypothyroid and started law school at Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. And in the middle of my second year of law school, I was working for the NASA Ames Consortium down there for astro law research, which looks into the law of outer space, essentially. And I was doing a project on equal access for people with disabilities onto space shuttle missions, because I'm an occupational therapist and I was combining those skills with my legal training. And I was talking to the general counsel of NASA Ames, and I just collapsed on the floor with severe chest pains. I just doubled over into fetal position, and the paramedics were called and they did an EKG, and the EKG came up negative, but I was still in severe pain, so they took me to the emergency room, and the pain would not subside. And finally, they figured out that it was my esophagus contracting. The esophagus is right next to the thyroid. And apparently my thyroid was doing a final sort of shutdown. And in the antibodies, because I started with autoimmune thyroid disease, somehow there was an allergic immune kind of reaction happening that caused my esophagus to contract. So I had severe chest pains all the way down all the way from here to here for months. They still didn't diagnose me correctly because they still didn't know about the radioiodine. Then I progressed along, and I was very skinny. I was down to 110 pounds because I couldn't hold any food down. My digestive system had gone nuts on me. Had incredibly severe headaches. I was breaking into cold sweat. I somehow made it through law school. I just kind of pat myself on the back for that. I don't know how I did it, because I was quite myxedemic. It's a symptom of severe hypothyroidism. You can't concentrate, and stimulus, any noise or sound kind of confuses you. So I was dealing with that while getting through law school. I was very skinny, and my hair just started sticking out because I went through transient hyperthyroidism before I crashed into hypothyroidism. I've heard this from many other people that have gone through what I went through. Then my heart became irregular, and I almost had a cardiac incident. Then, to make a long story short, I got married after law school. I tried to get pregnant. I couldn't. I was trying to figure out what was wrong. None of the tests were showing that I had any real problems. And I was up visiting my grandmother in Spokane in 1988. Just by chance, I picked up the Spokesman Review, which had one of the first articles by Karen Doran Steele on the radioiodine released from Hanford. It said it was released in the 1940s. So when I read the article, I felt terrible when I first read it, because I thought, oh, how awful, how terrible to be exposed to this horrible substance and without any choice. And I said, well, thank goodness, I was born in 1950. I've escaped that. Whew, I just felt so much better. Not realizing that the radioiodine had actually been released all the way into the 70s, but they didn't know that yet. Took this article on the radioiodine back to the fertility clinic. I said, I know you tested me for thyroid disease here in this fertility clinic, because they do that in fertility clinics. Could you have given me the wrong test? And so they realized they'd given me a T3 test, and what I needed was a free-floating T4 test. They gave me the blood test over. It came up so abnormal that the pathology lab called me directly. They don't usually do that. They usually call the doctor calls you. They said, your TSH level, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone that's put out by the pituitary to try to get your thyroid to work, if your thyroid's not working, was 33.3. The norm is 2.5 to 5. They said, we can't believe you haven't died of a cardiac incident or gone into a coma. That's how much in danger my health was and my life at that time. Had the Department of Energy told people like me that they needed, at least told us to go get our thyroids checked, I wouldn't have been through hell for 20 years, and I wouldn't have almost died. I was put on synthetic thyroid hormone. I got pregnant the next cycle. I'm on synthetic thyroid hormone for the rest of my life. But in the meantime, I went through my esophagus contracting. That was severe pain. My knees, I have osteonecrosis. My knee joints have been ruined because during the time I was severely hypothyroid, before the Department of Energy told us about the radioiodine from Hanford, I tried to jog to get rid of the extra weight I was gaining because I was hypothyroid. By jogging during a time of being severely autoimmune and hypothyroid, it somehow destroyed the cartilage in my knees. So now I'm unable to walk more than a mile at most, and I'm lucky if I can do that. And I have no cartilage left in the knees. So my father died of thyroid cancer 3 years ago. He was the engineer at Hanford who believed that there was nothing wrong there, who laughed at my work when I started working on Hanford issues. My mother had thyroid disease. There's no history of thyroid disease anywhere in our family except those of us who lived in Richland. So when I see things like the Hanford Thyroid Disease Study, where they tell us to be reassured that our health hasn't been impacted by Hanford's radioiodine, I'm almost speechless, because what they're saying does not reflect the reality of people like me. My whole family's dead now, except for myself. And I'm not in very good shape myself. My mother died this March of rapidly metastatic malignant melanoma. And she also had hyperparathyroidism and thyroid disease. Her immune system was not strong, and I think that's one of the reasons that the malignant melanoma just took over her body. It killed her in 6 weeks. So I'm not saying this to evoke pity or emotion. I'm stating it as a fact, because one of my goals in life is to try to educate people on what happened. The second goal I have is to try to make the government responsible to the people that they've hurt, by at least acknowledging this has happened and by providing at least some medical care for people who need it and who are sick. But I think it's outrageous that the Department of Energy could have told us so many years before about what happened, because it would have saved a lot of us all these symptoms, all this disease, and I think some lives, because some people have died of going into hypothyroid comas and cardiac arrest from thyroid disease. And had the medical monitoring program that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry recommended been running and been funded by the Department of Energy, my dad would be alive now. So